Jimmy Fallon finished the story. Clint Eastwood bowed his head, took a deep breath, and the entire studio watched the legend cry. The Tonight Show. Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Monday night, October 2023. The audience was buzzing with excitement. Clint Eastwood, 92 years old, Hollywood royalty, the man with no name himself, was sitting in the guest chair for a rare talk show appearance. Jimmy Fallon had been thrilled about this booking for weeks. Clint didn't do many interviews anymore. When he did, they were usually short, focused on whatever film he was promoting, and carefully controlled. This was supposed to be a standard promotional interview. Talk about his latest project, share a couple of old stories, maybe laugh about his Dirty Harry days, and wrap in 12 minutes. It was going exactly according to plan. Jimmy had asked about Clint's new film. Clint had answered in his signature gravelly voice, economical with words as always. They'd shared a laugh about a behind-the-scenes moment. The audience was eating it up. The Roots were ready with bumper music. Everything was perfect. Then Jimmy glanced at his blue note cards, the ones he always kept on his desk with talking points and backup questions, and saw something his producer had added at the last minute. A handwritten note. Woman in audience, row K, seat 7. Elizabeth Morrison. Ask Clint about the letter. Jimmy's brow furrowed slightly. He hadn't been briefed on this. He looked up at his producer, who was standing just off stage. She nodded, mouthing, "Trust me." Jimmy looked out at the audience, trying to spot row K. He saw her immediately, an elderly woman, maybe in her 80s, sitting very still, both hands clutched around a small envelope in her lap. She was staring at Clint Eastwood with an intensity that was visible even from the stage. "Clint," Jimmy said, departing from the planned questions, "I want to ask you about something, but first I need to acknowledge someone in our audience." Clint's expression didn't change, that famous stoic face that had stared down countless movie villains without flinching. "Ma'am," Jimmy said, addressing the woman directly, "in row K, Elizabeth Morrison. Would you mind standing up for a second?" The woman stood slowly, shakily, still clutching that envelope. The audience turned to look at her. Clint's eyes followed Jimmy's gaze, settling on the elderly woman. "Ms. Morrison wrote to our producers 3 months ago," Jimmy said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "She told them a story. And she asked if there was any chance, any possibility, that we could help her share it with you, Clint, if you ever came on the show." Clint was leaning forward slightly now, his eyes locked on the woman. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said in that distinctive voice. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling but audible through the studio. "But you met my brother. In 1968. In Da Nang." Jimmy stopped mid-sentence. The entire studio froze. The change in Clint's face was subtle but unmistakable. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed slightly. That carefully maintained composure wavered for just a fraction of a second. "Da Nang," he repeated quietly. "Vietnam," Elizabeth continued, tears already streaming down her face. "You were there doing a USO tour. You weren't even that famous yet. Maybe 2 or 3 movies. But you came anyway. And you met my brother, Corporal James Morrison. He was 19 years old. He'd been in country for 8 months." Jimmy looked at Clint, then back at Elizabeth. The studio was absolutely silent. The Roots had stopped moving. The cameramen had instinctively tightened their shots. "Ms. Morrison," Jimmy said gently, "do you want to come down here? So you don't have to shout across the studio?" Elizabeth nodded. Studio assistants helped her down from row K, and she made her way slowly to the stage. Jimmy stood and helped her up the steps. Clint Eastwood stood too, something he rarely did during interviews, and faced the woman directly. She was holding that envelope in both hands like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, "my brother wrote me a letter from Vietnam. It arrived 2 weeks after he was killed. October 1968. He was caught in an ambush. He was 20 years old. Clint's face had gone very still. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." In his letter, Elizabeth continued, her voice shaking. "He told me about meeting you. He said you spent 2 hours with his unit. You weren't supposed to. The USO's schedule only had you down for 30 minutes, but you stayed. You talked to every single soldier. You signed whatever they wanted signed. And when my brother told you how scared he was, how he'd been having nightmares about dying so far from home, you sat with him. Just the two of you. And you told him something that he said saved his life for the 2 weeks he had left. The studio was so quiet you could hear people breathing." "What did I tell him?" Clint asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth opened the envelope with trembling fingers and pulled out a worn, yellowed letter. The paper looked like it might disintegrate if she wasn't careful. She unfolded it slowly. "May I read it?" she asked. "Please," Clint said. "Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." Elizabeth held the letter close to her face, her hands shaking. She read in a quiet voice that somehow carried through the entire studio. "Dear Lizzie, I met Clint Eastwood today. Can you believe it? The guy from those spaghetti westerns. He's here doing some show for the troops. Everyone wanted to meet him, get autographs, take pictures. But when it was my turn, I guess he could tell I was in rough shape. I haven't been sleeping well. The nightmares are getting worse. I'm scared all the time, Lizzie. Scared I'm going to die here. Scared I'll never see home again. Never see you or Mom or Dad." I didn't mean to tell him all that. It just came out. And you know what he did? He didn't give me some patriotic speech or tell me to man up. He just sat down next to me in the dirt, right there in front of everyone, and he said, "Fear doesn't make you a coward. Fear makes you human. The brave ones aren't the ones who aren't scared. They're the ones who are terrified and show up anyway." Then he told me about a time when he was scared. I won't write the details because it's his story to tell, but he was real with me, Lizzie. This movie star who could have just signed an autograph and moved on, he was real. And then he gave me this. Elizabeth reached into the envelope again and pulled out a small, tarnished metal coin. She held it up. Even from a distance, you could see it was old military currency. "It's a coin from World War II, Elizabeth said. "Jamie wrote that you told him your father carried it through the entire war. That you'd carried it through all your fears, all the times you wanted to quit acting, all the times you felt like a fraud, all the times you thought you weren't good enough. You gave it to my brother and told him, 'Carry this. And when you're scared, remember that scared people have been doing brave things for a long time. You're in good company.'" Clint's hand had risen to cover his mouth. His eyes were glistening. "Jamie carried that coin for 2 more weeks," Elizabeth said. "It was in his pocket when he died. The army sent it back with his effects. I've had it for 55 years. And Mr. Eastwood, I came here tonight to give it back to you." She held out the coin with a shaking hand. Clint didn't move. He was staring at that small piece of metal like it had reached across 5 decades and grabbed him by the throat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking, "that belongs to your family. To your brother's memory." "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "You gave it to him when he needed it. And Jimmy," she turned to Fallon, "told me something when I wrote to the show. He said you've spent your whole career using your voice to tell stories about courage and honor, and what it means to be brave. My brother's story is part of your story. And I think you should have this back so you remember that what you did in Da Nang, sitting in the dirt with a scared kid and treating him like a human being, that mattered more than any movie you ever made. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jimmy looked at his producers off stage. They were signaling to wrap up. This had already gone way over time. But Jimmy shook his head slightly. Not yet. He pulled out his desk chair and gestured for Elizabeth to sit. Then he grabbed the guest chair Clint had been sitting in and repositioned it so the three of them formed a small circle. The cameras adjusted. The Roots waited. The audience didn't make a sound. Jimmy sat down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Clint, do you remember that day?" Clint had finally taken the coin from Elizabeth's hand. He was turning it over and over between his fingers, his face a war between composure and emotion that composure was losing. "I remember all of them," Clint said, his famous voice reduced to something raw and unsteady. "Every tour. Every base. Every kid who looked at me like I was somebody important when all I was doing was reading lines someone else wrote." He looked at Elizabeth. "Your brother. James. Jamie. I remember him. He was so young. They were all so young. And they'd look at me like I had answers because I'd played tough guys in movies. But I was just an actor. I hadn't done anything real. And here were these kids, 18, 19, 20 years old, doing the most real thing imaginable. Facing death every day." Clint's voice broke completely. "I gave away that coin because I didn't feel like I deserved it anymore. My father earned it. Your brother earned it. I was just playing pretend." Elizabeth reached out and took Clint's hand. A 92-year-old legend and an 80-something woman who'd lost her brother 5 decades ago, holding hands on a late-night talk show while America watched. "Mr. Eastwood," she said gently, "my brother's last letter to me, the one that arrived after he died, he said that the 2 hours you spent with his unit gave them something they'd been missing. He said you reminded them that the world back home was still real. That there were still movies and laughs and normal life waiting for them. That it wasn't all just jungle and fear." She squeezed his hand. "You did something real. You gave scared boys a moment of peace. And you gave my brother courage in his last days. That's not pretend. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, saw coming." Clint Eastwood bowed his head. His shoulders shook. And the entire studio watched as tears rolled down the face of Hollywood's toughest icon. Jimmy had tears streaming down his own face. He wasn't even trying to hide them. The audience was sobbing. Grown men in the Roots had their heads in their hands. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something sacred. Clint pulled his hand away from Elizabeth for a moment to wipe his eyes. When he looked up, his face was streaked with tears, something virtually no one had ever seen in his 50-plus-year career. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Elizabeth said. "Just keep the coin. And know that somewhere, somehow, Jamie is glad you have it back." Jimmy stood up slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his own blue note cards, the ones he'd been using all night for questions and jokes. He walked over to Elizabeth and handed them to her. "These are what I use every show," Jimmy said. "They're just cards, but they represent every conversation I have up here. Every attempt to connect with another human being. I want you to have them. And I want you to write your brother's name on the top card so that every time I use them, I remember this moment. I remember that what we do here, making people laugh, sharing stories, connecting, it matters. Just like what Clint did in Vietnam mattered." Elizabeth took the cards with shaking hands. She pulled a pen from her purse and carefully wrote in neat, elderly handwriting, "Corporal James Morrison, 1948 to 1968. He was brave." The audience stood. All of them. 300 people rising as one in spontaneous tribute, not applause, just standing, hands over hearts, bearing witness. Clint closed his fingers around the coin. "Thank you," he whispered to Elizabeth. "For keeping his memory alive. For bringing this back to me." Jimmy helped Elizabeth down from the stage. As she returned to her seat, the audience parted for her like she was royalty. The show didn't continue with its planned segments. Jimmy simply sat with Clint for another 10 minutes, cameras rolling, and they talked about Vietnam, about fear, about the kids who never came home. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After that night, Clint Eastwood carried that World War II coin in his pocket again. At his next film premiere, a reporter noticed it and asked about it. Clint told them to watch the Tonight Show episode. That'll explain everything, he said. Jimmy kept Elizabeth's note cards. Corporal James Morrison, 1948 to 1968. He was brave. Became the first thing he saw before every show. And somewhere, in the distance that separates the living from the dead, maybe a 20-year-old soldier finally knew his story had been told.